Welcome back, everybody, to Nuts and Bolts Sports. I'm Raj. With me, as always, is Jordan, and we're here talking the NBA restart. I believe this is episode 8. On Friday, we talked about the Eastern Conference playoffs and what was going on down there. Now we have a couple games under our belt, but we're still here to try to unpack the first round of the Western Conference playoffs, preview it a little bit for you guys, and discuss what we can expect to see out of some of those matchups and who might actually progress into the later rounds. But we do have to open up with some news that dropped over the weekend. Alvin Gentry being relieved of his duties in New Orleans. He had been there for, I believe, his 5 seasons and only making the playoffs once in his stretch there. Not a great track record. Alvin Gentry has an up and down relationship with a lot of the teams that he's been on, and it's sad to see him go. It's always sad to see coaches go, but at the end of the day, New Orleans need to make a change, and they didn't feel like Gentry was the right guy to do it. What are your thoughts on this whole thing?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. You have a tough situation there where you get Zion, but then he's missing most of the year. So you didn't really kind of get to see that team at full strength. Plus, they are a pretty overall young team, which we kind of saw in the bubble with their, lack of defense, inability to close out games. So it's one of those things you can't put the blame, solely on Gentry because the players at the end of the day didn't get it done. And some of the situations were a little out of his control. But at the same time, I know the whole Zion thing was a pretty hot topic in terms of his minutes and when he was playing and stuff. So that probably factored into it. Plus, like you said, 1 playoff appearance in 5 seasons. The writing was kind of on the wall, especially with them being the favorite to probably get the 8 seed going in. Everyone was talking about how the NBA set it up for Zion, LeBron. And then that just doesn't happen. No. I know you said you had some thoughts on some coaching candidates. We know Ty Lue, Jason Kidd, and some others were ones, but Ty Lue and Jason Kidd seem to be the leading one, especially with Lue having a previous relationship with the GM David Griffin from Cleveland. Yeah. I personally am all, I'm for it from everything. It seems like he has a pretty good relationship with a lot of players. And he could probably help the development of Zion and Ingram and stuff like that with his coaching and previous playing experience. But you told me before the show you have some thoughts that you wanted to release, so I'll let you have the floor and you can go at it.
Yeah, Ty Lue is definitely a player's coach. The players like him, and that's because he's a young guy. He's not that far removed from the league in terms of he understands what these guys want and he tries to give it to them. But having dealt with him in Cleveland for a few years, he's just not a good coach. I'm sorry. He does not have any proper offensive schemes. The ball barely moves. There's so much ISO ball in his offense. Defensive rotations are terrible. There were so many, when David Blatt was there, Mozgov really understood his role in Cleveland in those first couple of years, and it carried into that championship year, and that's because David Blatt did start on the bench in that season, and Ty Lue came in partway through after David Blatt got fired. But Timofey Mozgov, when he was traded there the year before, he was not entirely healthy. He came into that next season healthy, and he was a defensive monster because he just knew what to do. He knew how to be the anchor of that defensive core, and that was the best defensive Cavs teams that we saw between him and Dellavedova and LeBron teaming up there. And then when
what a trio!
Yeah, it's a weird trio, but Dellavedova and Mozgov are they're gonna grit and grind. They're gonna get the job done, and obviously LeBron. And that team was better than any of those other teams defensively, and they were pretty good offensively as well. But when Ty Lue came in, he kind of blew things up, and I was not really a fan of David Blatt firing. I thought he just was still working into sort of what he had gotten into, and for him to go 55 wins, I think it was the season prior, and get fired 8 games into the regular season. I understand they were struggling, but Ty Lue was not the guy to pick it up. They didn't get really much better with Ty Lue. It was just LeBron turned it on to a certain extent, and Kyrie got really good in the latter half of that season. And that's sort of what carried them through the playoffs as well. I don't attribute any of that to Ty Lue. I love the guy. I just don't love him as a coach.
That's fair. The only 2 quick things I guess I'll add, because you have much more experience, like you said, with them being Cleveland. The first thing is the only thing I would question maybe, and this is, again, more towards your experience, would you say that the ball also stuck because LeBron-centered offenses tend to kind of scrap at the end? He's like, let me just run I'll pick my spots, I'll run the pick and roll. Or
no,
do you think that was Ty Lue?
the ball was sticking in Iman Shumpert's hand as much as it was sticking in anybody else's hand, and that's what was most frustrating. Like that, Iman Shumpert should not be playing ISO ball. J.R. Smith is going to play ISO ball; that's his thing. But
you can't tell him no.
Yeah, you can't tell him no. But there was like LeBron. I mean, you understand LeBron and Kyrie are going to do their things, but every other person around them was trying to hog the ball just as much as those two guys were. There was literally no offensive scheme. I could not pinpoint an offensive scheme. I've coached basketball for many years, and I feel like I have a pretty good understanding of the sport. But I could not pinpoint what exactly Ty Lue was trying to do on the offensive or the defensive end there in Cleveland. And the only reason that they won a championship and the only reason they continue to win 50-plus games, and in that final season there they didn't even hit the 50-game mark, is because they had LeBron James, and that's all it really came down to.
And the Draymond suspension, sorry.
I don't know about that. I don't know about that.
My final point, and then I guess we can kind of shift towards today's games, would be when I think of legendary big three, I think of like Magic, Kareem, Worthy, Kobe, Shaq, and player X, Wade, LeBron, and Bosh. And now I guess I have to add LeBron, Dellavedova, and Timothy Mozgov to that list. Up there in the annals of history in terms of greatness.
Only hardcore Cav fans like myself and the other three of us will ever understand what that means to the city of Cleveland. So you're gonna have to deal with that. But let's go ahead and get into the next topic, and let's just kind of discuss some of the games that we got out of the way earlier on today. Because we did see a couple of Western Conference matchups. Starting off with that really good Denver Nuggets Utah Jazz matchup. Mike Conley being out right now because of the birth of his son, so congrats to him. But Denver pulling away late in overtime and really taking that win. But Donovan Mitchell going for 57 points, ridiculous. Jamal Murray and him, young point guards battling it out at the end of the game. It was a lot of fun, and I didn't expect it to be as close as it was, but Donovan Mitchell kept Utah alive.
Yeah, I feel like Donovan Mitchell deserves his performance deserves if it was like Jalen and Jacoby, like a Jalen Rose, like Donovan Mitchell, go off, son, like something that like Jalen Rose would say. Or, whatever. But no, in all seriousness, he was phenomenal today. I kind of thought the same thing. No Conley. I thought Denver was going to, handle it pretty easily in regulation. They covered in overtime for the gamblers out there. But in regulation, I thought there wouldn't be an overtime. And he was just getting to the rim whenever he wanted, making tough shots, creating his own shots. And even when he would drive to the rim, like later in the game, he was getting Gobert involved too. Like he'd have this move where he'd get the pick and roll. Jokic, and this is partially on Denver, Jokic just sat back all game and had really no desire to help. So he'd drive into the lane and he'd jump, and Jokic would go with him, and he'd just drop it to Gobert for the dunk. So he had a really nice thing going. Third most playoff points ever, right behind Elgin Baylor and Michael Jordan. I mean, that's not anything to sneeze at. That's really impressive. And to do it at 24 years old. And then, you got to give credit to Jokic, who had a great game. Passing, shooting the ball, 4-7 from three. And then, Jamal Murray, that the end of regulation, he's the only reason it went to overtime. And then he continued to take over in overtime, kind of taking cues from Mitchell, basically running the pick and roll and getting the mismatch and getting whatever shot he wanted and making them. So it was just a really fun 2-guard battle and a great opening game for the playoff. Like that set the tone so high, even though the Toronto game, which we'll talk about, was kind of dud. But that game really set the bar high, and I'm excited to see that series now. It's going to be, I think, really, really competitive.
Every point guard in the league now is trying to match up to whatever Dame is doing in Portland, and Donovan Mitchell put on a pretty good impression out there because he was stellar, and Jamal Murray's been so good since coming back from injury. He missed a pretty early stretch of the bubble. I think he played in some of the scrimmages, but he didn't play in the opening seeding games, and he, in that first game back, he was pivotal in that win, and since then it's carried on. I think that win was actually against Utah, if I'm not mistaken.
Overtime,
so that he's just been pivotal, and you can see his impact, and he earned that contract, and he's now in the season he was kind of up and down. He had a bit of a roller coaster, but now I feel like he's found a bit of a consistent groove, and I hope he continues it, because Jokic is great, but he just can't do it on his own. You make the comment about the defense and whatnot. It's crazy to me that Denver is the 5th best defense in the league, tied with Boston, I think. That's
I don't see it.
It's ridiculous. And can you imagine, and it's not showing now because Gary Harris and Will Barton are both out. Probably their 2 best defenders in that starting lineup.
Yeah,
I think Paul Millsap has kind of slowed down, so I wouldn't necessarily put him in that group anymore. But it was a fun show, and then you sort of alluded to it there, followed up by the stinker of Toronto, Brooklyn. Not that I didn't feel confident about it before, but I feel even more confident now about the sweep predictions that we had last year.
Yeah, it was weird because Toronto came out pretty much doing what you would expect. Like they were up 25 at one point in the first half. Brooklyn just obviously pretty shorthanded. LeVert was, doing the most he could with what he had, really. Lowry was going off in the first half, and then it was like kind of like that classic, that inevitable letdown. I didn't think Toronto would do it because I thought they had too much. They have a championship pedigree and they have really veteran players, but it happened. Brooklyn got back in the game. They got within 7 points or so, and then Van Fleet just took over in that third and fourth quarter. He had finished with 30 and 10. He was unbelievable. Siakam had a great game as well. Ibaka gave him great minutes off the bench. So pretty much what we expected. From Toronto there. And like you said, I think we could probably agree that that's going to be a sweep. Unless Karis LeVert, that's the only thing, is like we talked about last week, is if Karis LeVert has one of those 40 points, 6 rebound, 5 assist games where they just can't contain him, that would be Brooklyn's only shot. The only 2 quick points I wanted to make with Denver, to get back with them real quick, is the 2 things I noticed today that are going to hurt them and probably are a reason why they're going to be out in the second round against Clippers if they make it that far. Is one, Jokic is obviously a very average to poor defender. He just doesn't move his feet, doesn't go out on pick and rolls to even hedge. But not only that, he gets so far in his own head. He had a stress in the third quarter where he didn't get a foul call. He got blown by a defense, and then he had that inbounds play where he went to inbound it fast and nobody was looking, and Utah stole it and had another possession right away. And it was his head's hanging. His physical, he's slumping the shoulders, all kind of whining with the rest. It was dude, just play. You're already supremely talented. You're still in the game. It was and they're getting blown out or anything. That to me is the difference between a star and a superstar. Jokic is a star. He's great. I love watching him play. But when he gets like that, it's so frustrating. It's dude, just stop with the whining. This isn't, high school, and just play. You're gonna find a way. You got to power through it, and that's what all the top level guys. Even when LeBron whines at times, and he does. He still goes out there and he gets ticked off and he plays really well. And Jokic, he let him affect himself. And the other thing too is obviously Michael Porter Jr. was the kind of the talk of the bubble for Denver. Didn't have a great game today, and I think this is where we're going to see some of those. Him being a rookie, he took some questionable shots that I think Mike Malone pulled him for at one point. And even on defense, he kind of seemed lost. He was collapsing so hard on Donovan Mitchell drives, and he was leaving the corner 3 open for 2.5 quarters. And I think he got sat for a bunch of the fourth and even a little bit of overtime. And I think, he's obviously a key piece of their system there, what they're trying to do. But I don't know if he's going to be able to I don't know if this is going to be his year per se in terms of the playoffs. I think he's going to have to learn a lot because he looks a little lost at both ends. But did you want to move on maybe and do some of the Western preview since we kind of covered?
Why don't we start with the Denver Utah series, because we do have a game under our belt and we're already on the topic, and I do have some continuing thoughts based off what you just said. Jokic, you hit the nail on the head right there. It's we all know that he has the potential to be an MVP caliber player, but he gets in his head, like you said, so much on the defensive end. But then I think we talked about it last week at some point, maybe even in the last episode, about him coming into these seasons and not being mentally or physically fit enough to play, and it shows on the court because he just looks like he's completely unfocused, and that is exactly what you're saying. It's what's holding him from being a superstar player, because I think more the defense will come, and I think Denver, he's not great on the defensive end and he does check out often, but when he is locked in, that's what gets Denver up to that 5th seed in terms of defense, is because he can anchor the defense when he needs to. It might come in short spurts like the way that James Harden does in Houston, but he does have the potential to do it, and I think at a better clip that James Harden does. But yeah, if he doesn't get his shit together, Denver's gonna be in trouble, because he is their star player more than Jamal Murray.
It goes through him always.
Yeah, everything needs to run through him, and what he does for that offense is so crucial that if you're not getting it on the defensive end, you're not going to get it on the offensive end, and it's just not going to get the job done, unfortunately. But I still think that Denver has enough depth to take this away. You talk about Porter Jr. being subbed out and the advantage of that happening. Despite Barton not being there on the wing right now, they have Jeremy Grant, who is an incredible pickup for them.
Yeah, he's a great piece.
Yeah, I mean, on both ends of the floor, too. Again, he's great defensively and offensively. He's so long, can get in all the passing lanes, is just really good on-ball defense. And then he can score the ball. He can attack the basket. He's good he's a decent three-point shooter. He was a perfect sort of signing for Denver this offseason to really fill that gap that Paul Millsap has dropped off in his older years. I think he was a really, really big pickup in that position. And that's why why I think that Denver is probably going to still take this series in 5, because Utah had to have Donovan Mitchell nearly put up 60 points for them to keep up with Denver, and they were swept by Denver in the regular season. Missing Mike Conley, like we said, I think that's a pretty crucial piece being lost. I think Jokic on offense, if he is focused, can tear Rudy Gobert apart next to the basket. I think just the way
he was in Spurs today too.
Yeah, exactly. The way he maneuvers, Rudy Gobert is one of the best defenders in the league, but that just goes to show how skilled Jokic can be on the offensive end. I don't see Utah taking more than a game off of Denver. It'll be a competitive series. I could see all the games going down to the wire, but I don't see Utah necessarily pulling a lot of these out.
Yeah, I flip-flop between Denver in 5 and Denver in 6. I went with 6 ultimately because I think Utah can put together some really excellent defensive stretches, which they did today, especially near the beginning of the third, pretty much the whole third quarter. Really, they really put together a lot of stops. They have some nice pieces. Like they can run out lineups with like Gobert at center. You have Royce O'Neal who'll play a bunch of different positions. Even Moutier is a good defender, and even guys like Ingles and stuff are like adequate enough. And then they do have, a bunch of shooters. Clarkson's a great spark plug off the bench. So, plus I think if they do get Conley back, I know they said he's out for at least the first 2, probably the first 3. If he is able to come back into the bubble and go through all that, make sure he's quarantined and testing and stuff, he could have one of those, like, I just had a kid, I'm going to go off for 20 and 10 games. So I think that, plus Mitchell, I think is good enough for a game on his own. So, but I still think, like I said, Denver in 6, even with all the complaints about Jokic and his pouting, and their lack of defense, and Michael Porter Jr., like Jokic had 29-10, Murray at 36-9, Grant, like we mentioned, had 19 off the bench, and even Monty Morris, I think, is such an underrated player. He doesn't turn the ball over. He plays so consistent. He had 14 off the bench as well. So like you said, their depth, even with Harris and Barton being out, really kind of showed. So they should go on to the next round.
Yeah, I think I do want to make one quick point as to something that you said earlier about Denver going up against probably the Clippers in the next round, and we'll get into that series in just a few minutes here. But Harris and Barton coming back is pivotal for that series. If they don't have either of those guys, they're done. They're done. If they have one of those guys, they're still in a lot of trouble. If they have both of those guys, then it can be a series. But we'll have to wait and see, because we didn't know that these guys their health was as bad as it is right now, like without them. So I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Did you have any closing thoughts on this, or do you want to kind of take the ball and run with the next series? What's your pick? What series you want to talk about next?
We'll say I wanted to go right into the Clippers because of the thing, but let's say that because that is obviously going to be just a fun series to talk about. Let's honestly, the next one that's like I gotta say least amount of fun would be Lakers Blazers, because I think OKC Houston has the potential to be like 7 games. But Lakers Blazers, obviously, the whole talk has been Dame's hot, he's out of this world. They almost run through everybody in the bubble, and the whole talk is like, can they pull the upset? Who's going to guard Dame? There's obviously a lot of variables at play. I guess we can start with the Dame and CJ thing. Obviously, the Lakers don't really have anybody to consistently make them work too much. Dame's pretty much going to get whatever he wants off of pick and rolls. If JaVale McGee or Dwight Howard or even Kuzma are in the game, they're going to hunt for those switches, and they're going to work most of the time. They're just going to have to hope that he misses. I mean, that's really kind of what it's going to come down to. The only way that I can see them bothering him is if he tries to start going to the hoop, is you have JaVale McGee, Dwight Howard, Anthony Davis, Kuzma. You could throw Giannis's brother Costas in there. Like, throw everybody in there, and they all have 6 fouls. And I'm not saying hurt. We don't want anybody to get hurt. I never want that. But just like make him earn his points. Like, he goes in the lane, knock him down, make him earn his free throws, and eventually guards get tired of going in the lane when they keep getting knocked down. And on the Lakers side, it's kind of like, it's a weird counter. Like, the Blazers have these 2 small guys who Lakers can't guard, and on the other end, the Blazers have to deal with LeBron and AD because they have nobody to guard. Nurkic isn't bad, but he can't handle AD on the perimeter. And LeBron, basically, their best option is Gary Trent Jr., who's 6'5", a very good defender, as we saw on John Morant in the final playing game, but doesn't. 6'5" versus LeBron 6'8", 260. It's either that or Mario Hezonja and Melo. So I think for every time you see Dame get the switch and pinpoint the Lakers bigs on that end, LeBron's going to come down, get the switches on Hezonja, get the switches on Dame and CJ, and just go right in the post. And LeBron is one of the smartest players we've ever had. He's going to make the high IQ play, whether it's getting his points at the rim. If they start to double and throw guys, he's going to make the right pass. It's going to come down, obviously, to the Lakers making those outside shots. And obviously Anthony Davis controlling things at both ends, which I think he's more than capable of doing. He averaged 33 and 12 on Nurkic back 2 years ago when they swept when he was in New Orleans. So I have this being still a fun series. I don't think it's going to be quite the fireworks that everyone expects because the Lakers have beaten them. The only game that they lost to Portland this year was the first game that the Lakers played after everything happened with Kobe. So I don't think anybody was mentally right in that game. The other 2 games they've won decently convincingly. So I'm going to go Lakers in 6, but I rambled a lot. You pick whatever you want to kind of talk about.
You said Lakers in 6?
I think 6. I think Dame is good enough. Dame's good enough for a game on his own, and the Lakers being lethargic is good enough for Portland to get another game.
I have Lakers in 5 here. I said that the West was going to be more competitive last week, and I haven't shown that in these first 2 series. This is another series that I think Lakers will win 4 of the 5 games, but I think that the games will more often than not, be closer than a lot of those blowouts.
And that's more important than 7-game series. If the games are tight, that's what's important.
It's still going to be fun. Yeah, exactly. And because of the streak that Dame is on, first and foremost, I don't know if we really need to spend too much time on him. But the big thing that I want to touch on that you mentioned is the defensive matchups. And this was a conversation that you and I were having back and forth on Twitter this weekend watching that Portland game, is that the wing defense for Portland is just, and the entire, all the guards, they could not play defense to save their lives. And Gary Trent Jr. came alive in that final quarter, had 3 or 4 big steals, a few huge deflections. He was massive for them. But yeah, him being 6'5", 6'6", or whatever he is, and not all that big, LeBron is going to be a major, major problem for them. And them missing Ariza and Aminu right now is huge. It's huge. And this is more than any other situation where I think that Ariza not deciding not to play here is going to be felt more than anything else. Melo and LeBron will go at each other. It's going to happen. They have the friendship. they have the battles. Melo is, Melo's still good. He's shown us that he's still good, but he's not going to be the player that LeBron. He's not the player that LeBron is right now, and it's not even close in terms of matchup. So that will be an interesting battle to watch. And I agree with you on the Nurkic point as well. We've seen Nurkic in the past few games getting completely gassed guarding guys who are not Anthony Davis. If he's guarding a guy as athletic and as versatile as Anthony Davis, stretching out to the wing and then attacking the basket, back to the basket, doesn't matter what it is, he's going to be worn out. And he is a good defensive player, but I don't think he's nearly enough to handle Anthony Davis. I have Lakers in 5, but I think it'll be close. I think it'll be a close series.
I will say, I think the one thing that we're going to see in this series, and LeBron's efficiency has not been good to start these seeding games. Attributed to resting a lot and just kind of trying to find his rhythm. Plus, the natural aging that he's finally starting to go through. I think in this series,
are you sure about that?
Well, that's the thing too. Is this better than anybody being a Cavs fan for that long. His teams often come into the playoffs kind of coasting. He got to that point in his career where he was once he was coming back after the Miami stunt, they would go into the playoffs, 3 and 5 in their last 8, 5 and 5 in their 10, whatever, and then they turn it on and they'd usually sweep in the first round. Yeah. So I think they're going to see him at a different level. And I think with the lack of wings, I think if I had to make one prediction for the series, I think LeBron James is going to shoot at least 53, maybe 55% from the field. I think he's just going to have a field day. And I don't think he's going to take a lot of threes. I think it's just going to be easy
back to the basket,
to
backing up Gary Trent Jr. in the high post, and then either, like you said, sort of finding a seam to attack the basket or dishing it out to the three-pointer.
The seams will be there. They will absolutely be there.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. I agree 100% with that. Do you want to hold the Houston series for the last one, or do you want to hold the Clippers series for the final?
No, let's hold Luka and Kawhi. They deserve to be last.
Okay, good. That's what I was hoping you were going to say. Yeah, Houston and OKC, one of the more underrated series, and I think you mentioned this on the podcast, and you also tweeted it out. I think is that you were hoping that this is where you really wanted to play in the actual arenas to see Russ go back, or Russ go back to OKC, and actually James Harden go back to OKC as well. Yeah. All going back to Houston, that would have been so much fun. But these teams, while it might not look like it on paper, they're going to make for a really, really fun matchup. Chris Paul, we've talked about him quite a bit here, but he's just been good. He's just been good on both ends of the floor. He's been solid. He's filled his role very well, and he's kind of exceeded a lot of our expectations. And I just trust him for some reason at this point, more than I trust a guy like James Harden. We also know that Westbrook is out for the time being. We don't know the timeline on that, I don't think. But I just, for some reason, I have more faith in Chris Paul than I do in James Harden.
So who are you picking?
I pick OKC in 7.
7? Okay.
I do think this one is going to 7. Yes, yeah.
Okay, that's what I have too. Although I could see it being like a tough 6, depending on who gets the momentum. Like you said, there's a lot of so much guard. There's going to be so much small ball. Obviously, Houston does that normally, but really, in terms of OKC, all they have is Steven Adams is their big, but Danilo usually plays the 4, and he's more of like he's kind of a finesse player and can kind of play a small. Honestly, they'll put him at a small ball center 5 if they have to. I think you're going to see a lot of like the 3-headed monster with CP3, SGA, and Schroeder, who doesn't have a good initials, like DS. I don't know. That's about all he's got. You're going to see those 3 out there with Gallinari and probably like Nerlens Noel, or maybe sub Roberson in there for Gallinari for defense and Nerlens Noel. And they're going to match up pretty well with Houston, even without Russ, Harden and his whatever 4 shooters they decide to put with him. They're a team that could do it. They really can shrink down. It's going to stink for Steven Adams. He's probably not going to play more than like 30 minutes a game in the series. But when he does play, he's going to be expected to get a lot of rebounds and get the quick, easy points in the paint. I think Russ right now, they said probably the first like 3, maybe 4 games. And it just depends on how he responds to treatment, which does stink because you want to see everybody at full strength in the playoffs. But Harden's struggles are well documented. His percentages dip in the playoffs pretty much every year. Last year, I thought he had a better postseason than he's had, but still didn't quite, get it done when it counted. And I just don't see Houston having quite enough. I think his ability, like we talked about off screen, having the best player in the series helps. So it's like Harden's here, and then you have Chris Paul, SGA, and Gallinari or somebody. Those are like OKC has the next 3 best players with Russ out, but Harden is so far above that I think he can win a couple games single-handedly as long as they get enough outside shooting from Eric Gordon, PJ Tucker, Jeff Green, those guys. But I think OKC is going to be able to fend them off in 7, maybe 6 games. But yeah, it would have been so cool to see Westbrook, because he definitely would have gotten an ovation for all his years of service. Same thing with Harden, and then it would have been interesting to see Chris Paul obviously back in Houston after some injury-filled years there. And it'll be interesting to see, we talked about as well, Chris Paul practicing with Harden for, that time in Houston. Does he know some tricks? Does he know kind of the game plan of what they're going to be looking to do? He's already such an intelligent player on both ends of the floor, especially defense. Is he going to be able to instill that in Oklahoma City? Something we'll have to see, but I think Oklahoma City has the slight edge.
The one thing that you mentioned that I want to touch on is the sort of the small ball situation and what OKC is going to do to respond to that. So you do think that they're going to try to match up with the small ball and take Steven Adams out of the lineup?
Because Noel is so good. Noel can sub right in, but yeah, go ahead.
Because I think Steven Adams is also a very underrated offensive and defensive player. I think he's good on both ends. He is a little big, he's a little slow to keep up with some of Houston's smaller guys, and I think that's where Noel would shine a little bit better than Steven Adams on the defensive end. But I feel like Steven Adams, he's not necessarily like the most crafty scorer, but he's a reliable scorer next to the basket. And I would trust Chris Paul to find him in the right situations in the low post and really just take it at PJ Tucker and score on him like over and over again right at the basket. Do you see that being a possibility at all? Because that's kind of where my mind was.
Yeah, I mean, like me saying like he might not play more than like 30 minutes, like he's still going to play 25 to 30, and I think he can be very effective in those 30. The only hesitation I see with him being out there is I think we've seen what even a guy like Rudy Gobert, like even though he doesn't have the offensive game that Adams has, he's a much better defender, and Harden has made him unplayable at times over the last couple of years when they've played Utah. So, it's one of those things where every time he's in the game, I imagine a Harden pick and roll to get the switch. And when I say every time, I mean like literally almost every possession they're going to try it. But like you said, I think his best skill on offense is he's obviously a good offensive rebounder, big, good screen setter, which is going to help. But I think he doesn't try to do too much. I think he's a rare player who he knows what his skills are. He's not trying to do any kind of crazy post moves or fadeaways or anything, even like outside jumpers, he only takes the wide open ones. So I think he can be very efficient for them. I am just concerned a little bit with the defense, but it's a luxury to have a guy like Nerlens Noel who I feel like doesn't get talked about as much because of his injury, stuff over the past couple of years. He's 6'10", 6'11", has always been a pretty versatile defender, and he could switch on. Like I would feel comfortable having him at least make Harden work a little bit compared more to Steven Adams. And then obviously it's great to have a guy like Roberson back. who's also a pretty versatile defender, can guard everybody that Houston's going to have out there. So it'll be interesting. We'll see how Billy Donovan uses it, and if Harden is able to manipulate things on offense the way that he has against Utah in the last couple of years. We'll see if he's able to emulate that against OKC and take Adams out of the game.
That's another actually pretty interesting thing that you bring up in the mention of Billy Donovan. Is Billy Donovan going to outcoach Mike D'Antoni here? Because Mike D'Antoni, he's got his specific style and he doesn't like to stray from it a lot. Billy Donovan being one of the coaches of the years this year, like you don't think that's going to happen at all?
I don't think either coach is like outstanding. I think they're both like D'Antoni is obviously well known for his offensive stuff, and you have to give him his credit there. But his teams have consistently kind of choked in the playoffs, going back to the Phoenix, the Knicks, like all that. Like I've never been one of those guys that's like, oh, they have Mike D'Antoni. Like it's not like whether it's Pop, you're like, oh, it's Pop. Like he's gonna, he's already got. They already have the edge walking in. Like I don't see that with D'Antoni. I see him. All he does is whine on the sidelines and just ask them to shoot more threes. But Donovan had a good year. He's made the best out of what he has with that roster, which no one thought was going to make the playoffs, me included. I had given up on Chris Paul. I apologize. But we'll see. It'll come down to like the defensive adjustments I think that Donovan can make. Because like you said, I don't think D'Antoni is going to change too much.
That's exactly what I'm referencing, and I think Billy Donovan will outcoach D'Antoni because D'Antoni's going to stick to his offensive scheme. He's not going to change anything up. He knows what he wants out of his team, and Billy Donovan, I think, is a good defensive coach. You have to give Chris Paul a lot of the credit for OKC, but you have to give Billy Donovan a lot of credit as well because I think he made a lot of adjustments this season that, he has them in a position that none of us would have expected with Chris Paul surrounded by a bunch of young guys and injured Danilo Gallinari. Like it's kind of crazy to see what he's done with that team, and I see that actually being a pretty interesting thing that we need to keep our eyes out on. But let's go ahead and get it. Let's go ahead and you had OKC in 7, right? So we're
OKC in 7. Yeah.
Okay. That'll be an interesting watch. Yeah, Russell Westbrook could shift the thing one way or another. But let's go ahead and get into the final one now, so we can get off this broadcast and go watch Game 1. That's Clippers versus Mavericks, the 2 versus 7 seed, probably the tightest 2 versus 7 seed in the past decade, maybe maybe even longer. Luka versus Kawhi, the second string or the second tier player, Kristaps versus Paul George. This is gonna be so much fun. This series. It's a 2 versus 7. It feels like a 4 versus 5 in terms of closeness of how close these two teams match up. It's also interesting because Dallas is sort of at a historic clip in terms of offense, and the Clippers are one of the best defensive teams in the league. So this is just makes this thing all the more entertaining. Is one going to get the better of the other sort of advantage? I don't think I can pick the Mavericks here just because of inexperience more than anything. But also Kawhi, Kawhi shows up in the playoffs. That's what a lot of this comes down to. Like he's gonna rest, he's gonna do his thing in the regular season, but in the playoffs, like LeBron, you can just kind of rely on him. You can just trust him to do what he needs to do to get his team as far as he wants to get them. And Paul George, Paul George is an interesting thing because he's not quite lived up to expectations when he came over to LA. There's always been some conversation about his up and down play after his severe leg injury and whatnot, but I think he came back pretty strong from that injury, and then he's had a bit of a roller coaster since. I guess the biggest thing for the Clippers, I know they're still missing a few guys because of the whole quarantining and whatnot. I don't think everybody is back there yet, if I'm not mistaken.
So they did, not to interrupt, but they did announce today, at least that they'll be available. That Harrell, I think Shamet and Lou Williams are all going to be back and available. Now Harrell hasn't practiced in a couple, because he had the death of his mother, I believe.
His grandmother.
Yes. And so he hasn't practiced in like a week. Lou Williams has had some practices, has had a little game experience, and then Shamet's kind of in between too. So we'll see how much they play, in terms of shaking off the rust, but they are going to be available. So at least Doc Rivers will have that at his disposal.
I still think I have to give it to the Clippers here. This is another series that I was kind of going back and forth between 6 and 7 on this one. I ended up closing it in 6 just because of the experience factor. I just feel like Kawhi and Paul George are going to get it done when they need to get it done. But I think that Luka is probably going to be the best player in this series. If I had to pinpoint anybody, he was the best player in the regular season. I guess you can make the case for Kawhi, but I think Luka was just a tad bit better just because of his offensive numbers. But I think that this series, despite it not being a 7-game series, is still probably going to be the most fun of this entire first round.
Yeah, definitely. You said Clippers in 6?
Clippers in 6, yes.
Okay. I teetered on 6 or 5. I ultimately went with 5, but kind of like your other prediction earlier, like a very tough 5. I'm not, a lot of games, relatively close, maybe only one blowout. looking at it throughout the regular season, Clippers went 3-0, and they played Dallas about a week and a half ago in the bubble. With no Harrell, with a limited Lou Williams, stuff like that. And they won by 15. Dallas had a good offensive night, and the Clippers scored 126. So defense is definitely an issue. Luka, if he only has really two major flaws, and that's his three-point shooting for now, which I expect to change, and his defense, just because the kid's 19, 20. Like, that's just what happens at that age. You're not a good defender. And especially because even guys like Porzingis, they don't have one standout guy where I'm like, that's the guy I can put on Kawhi. That's the guy I can put on Paul George. Like, their best defender on the perimeter. I don't even know.
Dorian Finney-Smith, maybe.
Yeah, that's probably your best choice. And not that he isn't a bad player, but it's not somebody that I'd be like, wow, he's going to really make Kawhi work. I think you're going to see a lot of easy buckets for the Clippers. And then when Luka goes to the bench, I'm curious as to how their offense is going to run. I think a guy like Harrell is going to make Porzingis. He's going to bother him because Porzingis is kind of like Jokic, and they're a traditional, a little bit of finesse. They don't like a lot of physical contact. They get thrown off. They're that classic European that way. Whereas Luka doesn't. Luka, nobody wants to get bumped, and he gets a little whiny sometimes, but he'll play through it, and he'll get a little ticked, and he'll try to raise his game. I don't know if Porzingis can do that. That's kind of a big key to the series. Can Porzingis? He's going to be the tallest player pretty much. Can he take advantage on the glass, getting easy looks, in the post over guys, or is he going to let guys like Harrell and Zubac bother him? That'll be something to watch. Like I said, Clippers in 5. I think you're going to see, Luka's going to have. I think he's going to have a good series. I don't know if it's going to be great. I feel like there's a part of me that's worried that we're going to be a little let down, even though we've been hyping it up all this stream here, just because Luka is so young. This is his first playoff experience, and Porzingis is as well. He played for the Knicks. They weren't in the playoffs, so a lot of youth on the Mavericks side. That it's going to be a tough one for them, especially with Kawhi and Paul George. Those guys they're going to make Luka work every screen, whatever. They're going to trap him. They're going to make other guys beat him. And then if Luka tries to go by Kawhi, that just doesn't end well for most people, even a whiz kid like Luka. So I think we will have some fun moments. So I think we're going to have some great back and forth where Luka comes down, hits the 3, Kawhi comes down, just robot 2-3 points, Porzingis alley-oop. But you're going to have stretches where you're going to be like, oh my God, this is the best basketball we're seeing of the bubble so far. But I think the Clippers are going to come out on top and advance to the next round and probably go a little bit farther. But we'll get there as we get through the rounds. The one thing I do want to quickly notate before we head out, it looks like Boston's going to close out Philly. They're up 8 with 11 seconds left, 109-101. So that was a back-and-forth fun game. Philly took the lead, actually, in the third. And
surprisingly, because we both discounted Philly on the last episode. I think more than better. They showed up more than we would, but we both would have expected them to.
Yeah. They actually had some really nice contributions today, just not quite enough offense. They were only 9-27 from 3. Tatum has had a great game. I don't know if the game just ended, so he's finishing with 32 and 13. They got 29 from Jaylen Brown. So those guys carried it and beat at 26 and 16. Richard Jefferson 18 and 6. So not a bad night all around. For games we still have the Clippers game coming up here. It should be starting momentarily. So we'll get to see that first taste of Luka and Kawhi. But it's been a good day. It's been a really good day so far. We've seen some great performances, and we come back on Wednesday. We'll have a lot to talk about. First Lakers game, first Clippers game, first Bucks game. So there'll be, we'll see all the big guns in action, and I'm really excited. It's been a great start. I have a great feeling about this playoffs. So we're gonna, even though it's in a bubble, even though we don't have fans, that kind of really stinks now more so than these seeding games. I think we're in for a lot of good stuff.
I have to agree with you based off that first game alone. And like you just said, this Celtics Philly game being as close as it was, despite the fact that a lot of us, like a lot of people, including us, discounted Philly and completely counted them out of the series. They showed up, and I would imagine that this game that's about to get started now is gonna get us pretty excited just as easily as these other games did. But yeah, that'll bring us to a close for this episode. We will be back on Wednesday recapping this final game tonight and tomorrow's first matchups, and we'll have a few games throughout the day on Wednesday as well. So we'll probably go live right around this 8 to 9-ish time on Wednesday as well. So be sure to tune in then. We've got our social medias down there. Be sure to follow Nuts and Bolts on our website as well as on all social media platforms. And we'll be back on Wednesday. Thanks for joining us, everybody.
Go Lakers.